They lie to you. If you don't know this, you will always lose. The market right now is anything but normal. Institutional headlines keep dropping one after another, and sentiment is snapping back and forth between fear and greed. Most investors can feel that something is changing, but they're still moving without really knowing what's going on underneath. But before we dive in, there's one thing that you need to know. At Trading 101, all the market analysis in this video is available for free. We've laid out short and mid-term scenarios, key support and resistance zones, and even breakdowns of what the big players are trying to do. So if you invest in Bitcoin, this is a must-watch. You can find everything through the pinned comment or the link in the description. So right now, the Bitcoin market isn't just going up and down. There's a massive shift happening that nobody is really talking about. From institutional moves to T-Mobile joining as a validator, to MicroStrategy's so-called sell scenarios, and the never-ending Mt.Gox saga. The headlines you see and the real structure of this market are two very different things. And the core message of today's video is just this: the gap between those who understand this flow and those who don't is going to explode in this cycle. Let me ask you a few questions. Why are big corporations and institutions making moves right now at this exact timing? Why does the market look dangerous while the people with real money are still quietly buying? Is MicroStrategy really getting ready to sell? Or is there another layer to that story? Can the Mt.Gox issue actually shake this market anymore? Stay with me until the end and I'll answer all of these questions. We'll break down the real intentions driving this market right now, and I'll point out the key clues for the next big move in price. Alright, let's get started. And stay focused all the way through, because what I'm about to show you is the hidden truth behind what's happening in the market right now. Headlines say institutions are finally entering, corporations are joining for the first time, and everything is labeled unprecedented. Let me be clear. Most of those headlines aren't about things happening now. They're delayed reports of things that were finished long ago. So why are we only seeing this now? Simple. New investors enter the market every day, and they only see today's headline. They don't know the history behind them. That's why what institution did 3 years ago suddenly looks like breaking news today. But here's the real issue. While the news arrives late, institutions have already finished building their positions quietly. One example, when BlackRock announced in 2023 that it was entering the Bitcoin market, the whole world was shocked. People say, finally, institutions are here. But if you look at their internal documents, BlackRock's on-chain research and ETF design has started long before that. The announcement was just the moment it became official. News always come after the fact. Real money moves long before the headlines. So the institutional news that you're seeing now is mostly deals closed a year ago. Adoption plans launched 2 years ago. Technology tested long ago. And OTC networks already built out. All this was set up long before it ever hit the news. The conclusion is simple. In the market, the more expensive thing is information you learn too late. This chapter was to give you the foundation that you need for what comes next. Next, I will show you clear evidence that T-Mobile, Doichitellekommen, and major telecom and financial giants have already been running blockchain infrastructures for years. Let's talk about T-Mobile. So recently, you might have seen headlines like T-Mobile joins Theta Networks as a validator. A major corporation verifies a blockchain for the first time, and the media treated it like almost a historic first. But that's not what actually happened. This wasn't the first time. It was just the continuation of something that had been going on for years. T-Mobile's parent company, Doichitellekommen, has been quietly active in multiple blockchain networks for years. Around 2021 and 2022, they were already supporting stacking for several POS coins on their official site. In 2022, they began stacking Chainlink. In 2023, they joined as ETH validator. And by 2024, they were even preparing for Bitcoin mining. So what does this Theta involvement really mean? It's simple. It's not that they just joined. It's that the public finally noticed. Key point here. If a telecom company is already stacking, running nodes, and even mining, how deep do you think financial institutions are involved? Institutions like JP Morgan, BlackRock, and Fidelity have been testing on-chain systems, building ETFs infrastructure, and accumulating for years, all behind the scenes. Big corporations aren't going to enter the blockchain industry someday. They've already been inside, playing real roles for years. It's just that these facts are only now starting to surface in the news. So the real lesson from the T-Mobile story is this. By the time institutional involvement makes headlines, the real actions were finished long ago. This is why delayed information creates huge illusions in the market, and why regular investors are always end up one step behind institutional moves. Now let's talk about the border market. The T-Mobile example is just the tip of the iceberg. Much bigger moves have been happening quietly in the background. Institutions didn't suddenly decide to enter. They were already here. We just didn't see it. When several major banks announced that they'd offer Bitcoin trading and custody in 2025 and 2026, people reacted the same way. Wow, finally banks are accepting crypto. But if you think about it, even for a moment, the logic is obvious. For a bank to sell Bitcoin and store Bitcoin for customers, it means they must have already secured Bitcoin beforehand. You can't sell what you don't have, right? Which means banks quietly prepared for this long before the official announcements. ETF structure design, custody partnerships, liquidity sourcing, OTC accumulation, all of these invisible processes were underway for years. And why does it matter? Because most institutional involvement that hits the news today is basically a delayed report of actions that already happened. That's why retail investors are always late. Price rises after institutions accumulate, and articles only appear after institutions finish positioning. And here's an even stronger point. Given the massive scale of accumulating by institutions, nations, and major corporations, the price you are seeing now does not fully reflect that. The price swings you see are just surface level ripples. The real market structure is the result of years of long-term accumulation. So here's the one simple conclusion. Most of the major players in this market have already finished building their positions. What you're seeing now isn't their preparation. It's just the first visible signs of what they prepared long ago. Now let's move on and talk about why within this massive structure, suddenly there were rumors about MicroStrategy selling and what that actually means. Let's talk about MicroStrategy, one of the most misunderstood topics in the market right now. Recently, rumors like MicroStrategy is selling or Sailor is finally unloading Bitcoin started spreading and shaking the market with unnecessary fear. But here's the truth. This wasn't a signal that they're planning to sell. It was more like publishing an emergency manual, that the kind that only activates under extreme, unlikely situations. So in other words, it wasn't a strategy change. It was simply documenting the worst case scenario. In a recent interview, CEO Feng Li said for the first time, if we ever faced an absolute life or death crisis, we might sell a small portion of Bitcoin. Taken alone, that sentence sounds terrifying. But the full context is completely different. They mentioned two conditions under which a sale might happen, and neither is realistically likely. The first condition, if MicroStrategy's stock price stays below MNAV, the per share value of the Bitcoin they hold, for a long period of time. Their business model relies heavily on issuing stock or bonds at the premium and using that capital to buy more Bitcoin. That increases their key metric BTC per share. But if the stock loses its premium and falls below MNAV, issuing more shares would severely dilute existing shareholders and break their core KPI. Only then would they even consider a temporary defensive sale. The second condition is even more extreme. A full shutdown of the capital markets, meaning they can't raise any capital at all. MicroStrategy has mandatory payments, preferred dividends, interest payments, totaling hundreds of millions per year. If the entire market froze and capital inflows stopped, they might have to sell a tiny amount to keep the company alive. The CEO was clear. This is not abandoning the long-term strategy. This is a defensive measure to protect BTC per share. Meaning, even if they sell a bit in the short term, the goal is still long-term accumulation. Sailors never sell narrative, and the leverage structure make this sound dramatic, but in reality, it's just the first time that they've disclosed their risk manual. So the market split into two interpretations. One group panicked, oh no, they might sell. And the other, the more professional view, was, oh, the risk disclosure is officially out. The key point is this: there is no selling plan. The strategy is the same, long-term Bitcoin accumulation. And the chance of these conditions happening at the same time are extremely low. So in short, the MicroStrategy sell rumor was just another exaggerated fear story, not a real threat. In reality, their long-term buy and hold strategy is unchanged. If anything, this whole situation only reinforces how deeply Bitcoin-centric their business model truly is. Next, let's talk about Mt.Gox, another source of recurring fear, and one the market has misunderstood for over a decade. Mt.Gox is one of the oldest fear signals in the crypto market. And yet, every time it resurfaced, it gets interpreted in completely the wrong way. Many investors panic when they hear once Mt.Gox coin are released, the market will collapse. But in reality, that fear has been repeated and proven wrong for over a decade. Let's recap the situation very simply. Back in 2012-2013, Mt.Gox handled the majority of global Bitcoin trading value. Then a massive hack occurred. The BTC disappeared and users lost their coins they had deposited. So what happened afterward? The repayment process dragged on through 2015, 2017, 2020, 2022, 2024, 2025, and now been delayed again to 2026. Some victims had thousands of Bitcoin purchased at 15 cents, $1, or $35 locked up. Like, receiving them back would change their entire lives. But every time the same thing happens, we are about to distribute. This is the final step. This time is really coming. And the result? Another delay. So the infamous Mt.Gox supply bomb the market keeps worrying about is actually a risk that keeps disappearing over time. To this day, not once has there been a case where victim coins suddenly flooded the market and crashed the price. In fact, the reality is the opposite. Victims aren't eager to sell, they've simply been begging for their coins back for over 10 years, and the process keeps getting slower. So why does this news keep shaking the market? Because to average investor, a big incident from the past is enough to trigger fear. But if you look at the on-chain data and the legal process, there is extremely low probability of a sudden large sell-off happening anytime soon. What this really shows is the difference between institutions and retail investors. Institutions accumulate quietly, retail investors panic over coins that have been locked up for more than a decade. This is the structural truth of the market. Mt.Gox isn't a market-destroying bomb. It's an overinflated fear narrative based on history. And this latest delay is just another repeat of the same pattern. Now let's wrap this all up. In the final chapter, I will show you how everything, institutional accumulations, the T-Mobile case, MicroStrategy structure, and Mt.Gox fear comes together into one big picture shaping the entire market. All the things we talked about today ultimately connect into one big picture. Retail investors only react when the news breaks. They panic when fear shows up. And they only realize institutions are entering after the official announcements. But the real market moves long before any of that. Global companies like T-Mobile have been running blockchain infrastructure for years, and banks and asset managers secured Bitcoin well before their official announcements. MicroStrategy wasn't signaling a sell. They simply disclosed an emergency manual while keeping their aggressive accumulation strategy intact. Mt.Gox, despite fueling fear for a decade, keeps getting delayed and poses far less real risk than people think. In other words, the headlines you see today are just echoes of actions completed long ago. The market always moves several steps ahead of the surface narrative, and only those who understand this get a lead in the next cycle. The core message is simple. Institutions are already here. Their positions are already built. And what we are seeing now is just the beginning of a groundwork surfacing. The events of the coming months and years will naturally unfold along this same trajectory. Why institutions are buying, while global companies operate nodes, and why corporations are placing Bitcoin at the center of their balance sheets. It all points in one direction. Now, there's one thing you must do. Develop the ability to read the real structure behind the market. Once you have that perspective, you'll be able to move long before everyone else when the next big wave comes. Thank you for watching until the end. If you pair today's insight with Trading 101's real-time market analysis, your strategy in this market will become clearer. Check the pinned comment and the description for the links. Make sure to review the current scenarios, and I will see you in the next video with even deeper and clearer analysis.